This is Slow Food Live. Slow Food Live is our way of bringing slow food into your home, and I am really glad to welcome Chef Kevin Mitchell for today's session. Chef is a longtime supporter and member of Slow Food, a longtime slow food advocate. He is a member of the Slow Food USA Board of Directors and a member of Slow Food Charleston, active with Slow Food Charleston, has come to Slow Food Nations the last several years, longtime Cooks Alliance member. Kevin, you have done so much and put so much energy and love into slow food, and also brought the slow food values into your own work in many ways. Kevin is a chef, a researcher, a writer, and a culinary instructor, among other things, I believe. A very accomplished and impressive person, and I'm really happy to have you here today to talk about a history of Southern food. I think these stories and these histories are really, really important. And this is a session, we've looked forward to for a really long time. And as it goes, it is happening at a very poignant time. And so I think that this is a wonderful opportunity to hear and understand what you have spent a lot of time researching and writing about and understanding yourself. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you for sharing this story with us. I am just going to pass the mic to you from here. We're grateful for your time.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to everyone that's out there taking time out of their day to listen to some of my story and how I got into, the things that I do, the research, and how it definitely relates to slow food, how it relates to Southern food, so on and so forth. But for the most part, I just want to kind of go back and talk about how did I even get into cooking? How did I get into food? And that started at the age of 6 years old. I spent a lot of time with my grandmother, and my grandmother would, I have three brothers, and my grandmother would make me stay in the house while my brothers would go outside and play. And she would make me stay in the house and learn how to cook. And as a 6-year-old boy, I kind of didn't really understand why she was doing that. I mean, for me, I'd rather be outside playing with my friends and doing those things. But, that's what she felt that I needed to do. So finally, one day I asked her, and I said, well, Grandma, how come I can't go outside and play and be with my friends? And she just pretty much told me that, one day, you're not going to have me here or your mother here to, cook your meals and to wash your clothes and, even iron them, because she was teaching me how to iron at 6 years old for some strange reason as well. But still, it's kind of like, well, what about the other three guys, my three brothers that are out there? They need to know how to do that? And she just really didn't have an answer for me. So I just really feel that in her heart, she saw something in me that I hadn't seen yet. That was going to, make me gain this major love for food. And that's kind of how it started. The bond of being in the kitchen with her, learning how to cook meals and clean chicken and pick greens and snap peas and all those things was just things that, I gained this love for. So, around 7, I'm watching television, and there's a report on the news about the Culinary Olympics, and I see this thing about a cooking competition and gentlemen in tall white hats and crisp white coats, and from that point on, I decided that's what I wanted to do when I grew up. And I remember running into her room and telling her, Grandma, I know what I want to be when I grow up. I go, what do you want to be? I said, I want to be a chef. She said, oh, you want to be a cook? And I said, no, Grandmother, I want to be a chef. So I think even at that age, I kind of still knew the difference between being a cook and a chef. And that's where it all started. And from that moment on, that's really all it's been as far as, becoming a chef. I got my first restaurant job in a kitchen at 16 as a dishwasher. I worked at that place for 3 years before I was promoted to sous chef. And at that point, I decided to get a formal education, and I went off to culinary school for 2 years. I actually was able to come back to that same restaurant and take that sous chef position that 2 years later after I graduated, stayed there for another 3 or so, and decided I wanted to go back to school and get my bachelor's degree and which kind of wasn't necessarily a decision of my own. That was something that my mom had made that decision for me. She pretty much told me, "Oh, you're going back to school." And that was the best thing that I did because it laid that path, that groundwork for where I am today. So, once going off to culinary school and working in restaurants in Atlanta, in Ohio, and Michigan, so on and so forth, I make my way to Charleston. And at that point, still really just want to be a chef, not really interested in understanding Southern food. I knew what Southern food was. My grandmother grew up in the South, so I was familiar with some of that food, but never really got that passion until moving to Charleston about 12 years ago. 12 years ago, coming to Charleston and being involved in a test kitchen for a Gullah Cuisine cookbook, which introduced me to one of the truest cuisines in America, as far as the Gullah Geechee people are concerned. That really kind of started to lay that foundation for me to really want to discover more about that particular type of food and food of the South. And from there, just kind of came into Charleston, becoming a chef instructor, molding future culinarians, and in about 2015, I'm approached by David Shields, which many of you know, with the story of Nat Fuller. And for those of you who don't know, Nat Fuller in the late 1800s was the greatest black caterer in the city of Charleston, a former slave who went on to own his own restaurant downtown Charleston. And his major claim to fame was hosting this, what they called at the time, a mixed race dinner at the end of the Civil War. And what happened was, having this dinner, hosting this dinner with blacks and whites, being able to break bread in the spirit of equality pretty much for the first time. And he brings me this story, and he comes up with this really, at the time, I'm thinking crazy idea that we're going to recreate this dinner 150 years later. So initially, I was somewhat on board, but not really sure. I didn't know if he was really serious. But 2 weeks after our initial conversation, he totally inundated my email with anything I could ever possibly want to know about Nat Fuller. And so a year from that date, from that initial conversation, we held our own Nat Fuller's Feast 150 years later to celebrate his legacy and also to celebrate the legacy of those enslaved cooks that come before him, the ones that we know of, the ones that have names, and also to celebrate the legacies of the ones that we don't know of. And I'm going to get further into that as we go further into this conversation. So doing that dinner kind of just sparks this really great interest into trying to understand this history. And I had an opportunity, I got a phone call maybe a year or so later from John T. Edge from the Southern Foodways Alliance, and he had spoken to Frank Stitt, and Frank Stitt was interested in hosting dinner of that similar style in Alabama. And I was a huge fan of Frank Stitt, never met him, but I was like, well, yeah, let's do this. And long story short, never really came to fruition, but we got into a conversation about some of my educational goals. And I'd always wanted to go back and get a master's degree, and I had done a program a few years prior in education. And excuse me, this will sound weird, but I was in a program for education, and I just wasn't really happy. And it may sound weird. How can, you're an educator and you're not really interested in being in the program in education? But it didn't appeal to me. It didn't pull at, what I thought my educational goals were. And of course, what my passion had always been was really trying to understand the history of African Americans in cooking. So we're having this conversation, and he goes, it's like a light bulb. He goes, duh, why don't you think about the University of Mississippi? We have a Southern Studies program where you could fit in and you can focus in on Southern foodways and, the revitalization of Southern ingredients, and then of course your own personal passion of, the history of African Americans in cooking. And from that point on, I decided that I was going to apply. Of course, I got accepted, and in 2016, I packed up my life, loaded everything into a storage unit, and I moved to Mississippi and started my graduate studies in August of 2016. I became a Natalie Dupree Fellow. I worked with the Southern Foodways Alliance as a grad assistant for the first year of my graduate studies, and kind of got to see behind the scenes how the SFA worked. I was in the office during that great time when John T was actually writing his book. So it was kind of in that environment, and it really made me want to research more about the history of African Americans in cooking. So I get to Mississippi, I get into this program, and now I really want to start this research, and just stemming from the Nat Fuller stuff. And of course, you have to write a master's thesis. And initially, my quandary was what was I going to write about? What was my thesis going to be? And it just came to me: continue the work that you've done with recreating these lives and exposing people to the lives of freed, enslaved, or even formerly enslaved cooks. So this is where the master's thesis comes from, and a lot of people have seen it or they know it. It's called From Black Hands to White Mouths: Charleston's Freed and Enslaved Cooks and Their Influences on Southern Cuisine. And in this paper, there's a couple things that I wanted to achieve. One was to really get people to understand that Southern cuisine is not this small microcosm of one thing in particular. It's not just about when we think of the Deep South, where it's fried chicken and macaroni and cheese and all these other things that people associate Southern cuisine with. Southern cuisine deals with regionality, the different regions from the South that make up what we know as Southern cuisine. But in the paper, I also wanted to make sure that I tied it into the influences of these formerly enslaved and freed cooks. Because in my opinion, you don't necessarily get Southern cuisine without these cooks. And getting people to understand that during slavery, the cooking in the big house, the cooking in the field was always left to African Americans. So there were no white cooking meals. So these people are introducing this type of food. They're introducing some of the ingredients that come to us from Africa, and we will kind of go through those in a minute. And just getting people to understand that is the basis of where Southern cuisine comes from, and that we must recognize and acknowledge all the influences. There are other influences. If you're talking about the food of New Orleans, you're talking about French, right? Their influences. You're talking about, even in Charleston, at one point, you're talking about the influences of the French. You're talking about the influences of the English who come and settle in Charleston at one particular point. Also, we also have to acknowledge the contributions of Native Americans. A lot of things that we eat that we claim as Southern food come from the Native American. So, that paper was a way for me to get people to understand some of those things, and then also to understand the ingredients, the importance of the ingredients, how they come to us through Africa into the South. And for me, specifically at that point, it was always talking about Charleston, because my paper focuses more on dealing with Charleston. But my research kind of stems out a little bit further than that. So I'm writing this paper and deciding on how I'm going to go about writing this paper. And so I have the title, I have kind of a general idea, and normally when I give presentations, I take people through the process and I take them through my thinking chapter by chapter of this paper. So, and I will do that here as well. I mean, the first chapter, of course, is always the introduction. So this is where I introduce the concept that Southern food comes from the formerly enslaved African, and of course, the formerly enslaved African American. It comes from the paying homage to the specific ingredients that come to us once again through Africa. They come through Africa, through the transatlantic slave trade, and how those people bring those particular ingredients with them. And there's two different stories, and I'll get into that in a little bit. So in that introduction, I just introduce you to those concepts. I also introduce you to some of my own personal thoughts of where I feel Southern food is going, what or who are the champions of Southern food and what has happened. You know, so I also talk about how, as an African American chef, how at one point in our careers we decide that we are not going to embrace our heritage, right? We take this stand where we want to be recognized as chefs who can cook the finest cuisines of the world. So of course, we want to be involved in French cuisine, Italian cuisine, Spanish cuisine, so on and so forth. So as a chef, we're not opening restaurants that, uplift our race or uplift our culture by serving food of who we were or who we are. So I kind of broach that subject as well, and I talk about some of the chefs who were in that same way of thinking. So we talk about Eduardo Jordan, who, initially, and I've read some interviews of his, he says the same thing. And that's where he gets Solari from first before he goes into June Baby, which are both excellent restaurants. Right? And we talk about someone like Daryl Evans, who becomes the first Black chef to compete in the Culinary Olympics, who not only embraces French culinary techniques, but he embraces the food of Africa, the food of the South, in his cuisine, in the things that he prepares, right? And then of course I bring it full circle where I talk about my own personal experiences on how growing up wanting to be a chef, I wanted to be the next Thomas Keller. I wanted to be the next Emeril Lagasse, and never in my mind saying that I wanted to cook Southern food. But of course, that all changes when I come to Charleston and I start doing research. Right? So we move on to the three content chapters, the most important chapters in this paper, where the chapter we talk about the legacy and the lineage of Nat Fuller. So we go back to who Nat Fuller was, where does he come from, how does he get to a point where he's hosting this miscegenation dinner. And we know that Nat Fuller was of course a slave. He was purchased by a gentleman named William C. Gatewood at the age of 15. And William C. Gatewood is a person that is not from Charleston. He moves to Charleston, I believe, from Virginia or from New York, and he was heavily involved in the railway, and that's where he made a lot of his money. So he purchases Nat basically to be his manservant. He was someone that liked to host elaborate dinners, and that was what Nat Fuller was to do. However, Nat, the sir didn't have a lot of cooking knowledge, so he apprentices under Eliza Seymour Lee. And Eliza Seymour Lee is basically the matriarch, and that's where the lineage of these formerly enslaved and enslaved cooks come from. You know, her mother, Sally Seymour, was a very famous pastry cook here in Charleston. She owned businesses, and upon her death, of course, she passes her business on to Eliza Seymour Lee. And some of the interesting things that I learned about her is that even in her own business, she had to employ slave labor. Right? Her business was booming so well that she needed to employ people to help. And the only labor, once again, available to her was slave labor. Right? She couldn't get whites to work for her. She definitely wasn't going to get freed blacks. So she purchased slaves of her own who actually helped her run her business. She was also not only an owner of a pastry shop, she owned several hotels in the city of Charleston, and actually won a very famous court case in the city of Charleston with her business partner, a gentleman named Henry Gordine, who was actually stealing money from her. And she took him to court, and she was awarded restitution. And this gentleman had to repay her the money that he had stolen from her. So that's kind of where he comes from. And then I go into talking about basically his disciples, the people that come behind him, the Thomas Tullys, you know, the James Perrineau, right, and how they become basically the heir to the culinary throne upon Nat Fuller's death. Now, the one in particular is Thomas Tully, and at our dinner in 2015, we celebrated Thomas Tully. And Thomas, we asked Chef B.J. Dennis, a local chef here from Charleston, to stand in the shoes of Thomas Tully, and he was actually responsible for preparing the hors d'oeuvres for the cocktail reception, right, which was held in the actual building of Nat Fuller's restaurant, which was called the Bachelor's Retreat. And the owners, it's an art gallery now, but the owners were very gracious enough to allow us to hold this part of the dinner in this building, right? So then we move on to James Perrineau, we move on to the Castine brothers, all these chefs that come up behind Nat Fuller and Thomas Tully. And in that chapter, basically, I just write about their stories and, you know, their businesses and who they worked for and what their businesses were. Some owned grocery stores, some were, you know, like Nat Fuller had a restaurant, but he was also a caterer. Thomas Tully was a caterer. James Perrineau was a caterer who we come to find out, and those of you who are on from Charleston, if you know Burke High School, downtown Charleston, James Perrineau actually ran the cafeteria at Burke High, of course, prior to his death. Right. So me in that chapter, I wanted to talk about the ones that we knew, but we move into the next chapter, which for me was the most challenging, chapter, and for me, it's my favorite chapter to write because we write, and the title of that chapter is called Cooks for Sale. Right. So through research and getting some information from David, you know, I find ads, like newspaper ads, like ads for the sale of human bodies, with the exception in these ads, these human bodies were skilled laborers, skilled cooks, right? So in these ads, you see for sale, one black or mulatto, French, pastry, or complete cook, their age, sex, so whether male or female, and where they could be purchased. So when we talk about slavery and how slaves were sold in open markets, specifically here in Charleston, that is true. However, these particular enslaved people were only sold through private sale. So as a French planter, if I wanted a French cook, it would just be as simple as me going to my local newspaper, and at the time it could have been the Charleston City Gazette or the Post And I can see this ad, and I can see the brokerage firm or the address where I can go purchase this person. So in this chapter, I talk about those ads. And the most important thing I wanted people to know in that chapter is that I had pulled maybe 100, but of course there's more than that. That a majority of the ads, I would say a good 95% of the ads, were for the sale of women. So when we talk about Southern food, we're talking more than just about the food itself. We're talking about the gender issues that are involved in Southern food and in food, period, right? Because what I wanted people to understand, that at one point, women were doing all the cooking, and even they were doing it professionally. But then, of course, in my belief, as cooking becomes a white-collar profession, it becomes glamorized that, of course, men, we move in, we infiltrate, and then we push women out. And then, of course, specifically, we pushed African Americans out. And then, of course, further on, people of color, period. Right? So, because going back to in the big house, on the plantation, cooking was done by African Americans. The housewife was not cooking at all. She left that to African Americans. So in that chapter, discussing the ads, discussing kind of going back to some of those gender issues that kind of intersection with food, specifically Southern food. And then we just write about what their worth was, and not just monetarily. Like, they were worth more monetarily than, for lack of a better way to describe it, than an average slave, a slave who maybe did not have that particular skill. So as a cook who had the skill, you would go at a 25 to maybe even a 50% premium over that average slave. So, you could purchase a skilled French cook for $1,400, maybe even $2,000, right? And understanding that the worth of slaves was built on their ages, their sex, and how they were going to be able to work in the field, and if they had a skill. Right? So as someone that's being purchased in the field, you're a 15-year-old boy, you're pretty muscular, you're going to be worth a good bit of money. The older you get, the lesser in value you are. Right? So going back to these cooks were worth more monetarily, and then also, of course, just for the mere fact that they had this skill, right? And so these people who had this skill, someone like Nat Fuller could maneuver through the streets of Charleston. However, they had to carry slave badges, right? And they were normally made of copper, and they were stamped with whatever your skill was. Sometimes it could be the name of the person that owned you, and upon request, you would have to display your slave badge. So these skilled, and I'm even going beyond cooks. I'm going, coopers, seamstress, so on and so forth, who all had to carry these badges. So that chapter really, like I said, it was very challenging for me to kind of research how much a human body would cost based on the fact of whether or not they had a skill, right? And I'm more than willing to share the thesis with you out there. I mean, it is published through, of course, my university channels, but I am known to send it to you for free if you pop in your email, or shoot me an email, or shoot me a text. Some of you that know me, and I will be more than happy to send you that paper. So we're into that chapter, and we're talking about these cooks for sales. And I also include a grid or a graph that shows the different price points for these enslaved people. A really great chapter we move into is called the influence or influences through the ingredients. So in that chapter, I break down so many different ingredients that come to us from Africa, specifically in Charleston, because that's what I write about. Right? And I have some of those here that hopefully I will put them up so you can see them. But we talk about peas, we talk about rice, we talk about millet, we talk about sorghum, so on and so forth. So I do have some of those ingredients. I kind of want to go through some of those so you can see. Of course, the most important ingredient we have to talk about, especially as it relates to Charleston, of course, is rice. Right? We all know Charleston does not exist without rice culture. People come to Charleston, they settle in Charleston, and rice grew prevalently here in the area. However, they didn't know how to cultivate it. So in their minds, who knows how to cultivate it? Well, of course, the West African, because in West Africa, there's huge area of rice growing areas in the area of West Africa. And that's where they go. And they bring those people here to cultivate rice. And we know that Charleston becomes very rich off the sale of rice. So I will kind of show you, if you can see, this is a plate of Carolina Gold rice, right? And it's one thing to remember. Rice, there is rice growing regions in Asia, and Asia is well known for rice, but there are streams of rice that come specifically to us from the continent of Africa, right? So, and if you think of the streams of rice across the world, there at one point was well over 1,000 streams of rice growing throughout the world. Right? So here we always talk about Carolina Gold rice. And we called it Carolina Gold rice, or they called it Carolina Gold rice, because the whole of the outer shell of the rice was gold in color. And it was a rice specific to the area. And I want to kind of break off and talk to you about how people think these ingredients come to us from Africa. And there's two stories, right? And if you are interested in books, you can read, there's two books, one called In the Shadow of Slavery, and the other is called Black Rice. Those two books really talk about rice's influence from Africa to specifically Charleston, right? So one story in this book, the author talks about how women are, they're on the coast of Africa and they see these ships coming in. And in their minds, they know they're going to be taken away from their home. And what they have said to have done was taking grains of rice, okra seeds, watermelon seeds, peas, and they would sow them into the hair of their children, specifically their female children, which is a good way of saying, yes, that is how these products come to us. But we also read in those books, that the slave captains knew that they were going to be on a long journey, and they knew that they wanted to make sure the cargo that they were bringing to the New World would arrive alive and healthy. So they would purchase these ingredients that the African ate and would bring them on the slave ships with them. So, when you hear about or see stories of former slave ships that have been excavated and they find grains of rice and they find seeds, whether they're okra or watermelon seeds, that is how that happens as well, because the slaves were cooking on those ships as well as they were being brought to America. So that is kind of the story. And Carolina Gold rice has been has been brought back to us by several companies, but the two that I deal with the most, of course, Anson Mills, who introduces the world to Carolina Gold, excuse me, with Glenn Roberts, and then of course, which is in Columbia, South Carolina, which is about an hour or so outside of Charleston. Then also there's Geechee Boy Mills. And Geechee Boy Mills is I believe it's in James Island, which is not too far from Charleston. His name is Greg. Greg does some really beautiful things with cultivating Carolina Gold rice. Another important ingredient, right? And some of you from Georgia, off of the coast near Sapelo, could be familiar with this product, but these are Sea Island red peas. And I'm going to show you, we have my favorite, one of my favorites, of course, is black-eyed peas. Right? And black-eyed peas, it's my personal favorite, number one, mainly because it's one of the first things that my grandmother teaches me how to cook. So I always have a huge affinity for the black-eyed pea, and I do a lot with it. Right? But Sea Island red peas, it's a really small red pea. It has some really nice earthy flavor to it. And I get mine, and these specific ones that I have are from Anson Mills. They've been very supportive of the work that I do, and we use these in, we actually were using them in our student-run restaurant at the Culinary Institute of Charleston, where I was able to create a course around Southern food. And we were one weekend, and then of course the next week we were all sent home due to COVID. But these are some of the products that were on my menu. So we have these peas, right? And these peas, if you want to kind of understand the history of black-eyed peas were originally called cow peas, because at one point cows were the only things that were eating these peas. And then somewhere, someone brilliant said, hey, if cows can eat them, why can't we eat them, right? So this is how we actually started eating these types of peas. And these types of peas are very, very important because they're drought resistant, right? They grow without a limited access to water. Plus, they're not nutrient dense. So these peas actually, they fill you up once you eat them. And of course, they can be prepared in many different ways. They can be eaten hot or cold. I eat them both ways. I make a nice black-eyed pea salad with mango, or I do a red pea succotash, which I actually just did this past weekend with the red peas. So those ingredients. Two of my other favorite ingredients here, and my friends always tease me because they somehow find their way in almost everything that I cook here. You may not be able to see, but these are bene seeds, right? And bene basically are sesame seeds. They are the original sesame seeds that come to us from Africa. These are specifically brought to me, once again, from Anson Mills, and they produce these for me. I use these in many different ways. It's a very important ingredient because if you think about different areas, different plantations where proteins may have not been always available, the African would take bene and grind them up, and they would stir them in a pot of greens, collard greens, mustard greens, what have you. And they give you the sensation of having a protein, and also they have a nice little smoky flavor to them, right? And it was a way to stretch a pot of greens. It also can be used as a thickening agent. You can grind them up almost like filet, right, which comes from okra or the sassafras, right? So I use them as in crusting fish. I use them. I actually make a really beautiful bene seed vinaigrette from them. I will also stir them into a pot of greens if I don't want to have protein. But one important thing that comes from these seeds is this here. This is liquid gold. This is bene seed oil. And of course, the seeds are pressed for oil. At one point in history, bene seed or bene seed oil was the preferred cooking oil of many people here in Charleston. So important that even Thomas Jefferson tried to grow bene in Virginia and was not very successful with it. Right? It is a very volatile oil. You can get it from Anson Mills. You can also get it. There's a local oil shop here in Charleston. There's one downtown and there's one in Somerville where you can get bene seed oil. It is a volatile oil, which means when you get it, it needs to be stored in your freezer or your refrigerator. Just like a lot of products that I get from Anson Mills should be stored in your refrigerator or your freezer. It's a very neutral oil. You do get a little hint of that earthiness from the pressing of the seeds. Once again, it is a very good oil. It is a good oil to cook with. Someone's asking me the smoke point. It has a very low smoke point, so you can use it in sauteing. I've never tried actually frying or deep fat frying with it, but I will sear a piece of fish in it. I will, saute some vegetables in it. So you can definitely use that as a really good cooking oil. I use it, of course, to make the bene seed vinaigrette with a little bit of apple cider vinegar. I throw some turmeric in there. I do hit it with a little bit of traditional toasted sesame oil because that flavor in that toasted sesame oil does kind of push the flavor of the bene a little bit forward. Another important thing that we don't talk about a lot is rice flour. And rice flour is very important because it actually was the flour used originally in the creation of she crab soup, right? Because it's a finer flour, it's a thinner flour. It makes your soup a little bit velvety. And you can, for those of you who are gluten-free, this is a good product to use. I use it to crust fish to get a really nice caramelization on top of it. And also, once again, if I'm going to make a shrimp bisque, I will use rice flour. If I'm going to make she crab soup, I use rice flour. And of course, we know that comes from the grinding or pulverizing of rice into a flour. And there's two other things here, we'll move along, that are starting to gain some popularity. This here, these are sorghum berries, right? And we all know what sorghum is. It comes from the plant, and they boil it down. It's very similar to cane syrup, right? But this here is a really nice grain that can be cooked up like rice. It can be cooked down also into a porridge as well. And I'm actually starting to do some experiments with this. It is a little sweet in flavor. Once again, it's one of those new grains that you can also get from Anson Mills. And the last thing, which I didn't get from Anson Mills, I get directly, it comes from a company that comes directly out of Africa. And I don't know if you can really see it, but this is called fonio, right? And fonio, F-O-N-I-O, is an African super grain. It cooks up just like couscous. And I've gotten it from a chef from Senegal, Pierre Tam, who, if many of you were at this past Slow Food Nations, he was there doing a demo. It is a very nice grain. It's very easy to cook, right? And basically, it's kind of, once again, like couscous, a very limited amount of water on the stove for a very short period of time, and you fluff it up like couscous. But it is extremely healthy for you. You can get this you can get it off of Amazon. You can get it through his company called Yolele, which is Y-O-L-E-L-E. So going back to that chapter, I wanted to kind of talk about some of the ingredients, and there's many more, of course. I didn't, unfortunately, the okra I had didn't make it, but okra, very important. That comes to us from the continent of Africa as well, right? And the seeds can also be ground and used as a thickening agent like bene. You can press oil from okra seeds as well. One other thing I didn't get to have here is watermelon. Like watermelon is very important because it's a diuretic, right? And making that travel from Africa to America, it would help quench the thirst of slaves. And the seeds, of course, can be used to press oil. However, they don't necessarily use it a lot in the culinary side of it. I did see some research where African women would press the oil and use it as a hair product, right? So those are there, and there's so many other. We talk about millet, we talk about actual sorghum, so on and so forth, right? And then there's so many other types of melons, so on and so forth. So that basically is kind of where that chapter goes, talking about these ingredients and how they were used. And also in the paper, I talk about a very interesting thing that people kind of laugh at, but chicken. Chicken is very important, not only just for Southern food, but in when you talk about the culture of food as it relates to African Americans, chicken is very important. And those of you who will get a copy of the paper will read that. And then, of course, we move into the last chapter, which basically, of course, is the conclusion. It talks about, wanting to make sure that the food and the culture are properly recognized. So I do touch on a little bit of cultural appropriation in that chapter as it relates to the Gullah cuisine here in Charleston and how food or how you should properly credit those who create the cuisine in which you cook, or basically crediting those people for using a cuisine in which you may be gaining some fame and fortune from. So I talk a little bit about that, and then I go back into talking about, the Black chefs who at one point were kind of not embracing their culture, but now, of course, you see that Black chefs are doing it across the country. Restaurants, I always go back to Eduardo Jordan and the work that he's doing in Seattle. We can also talk about Todd Richards, who writes a book called Soul, and he talks about African-American food or soul food from his perspective, and understanding how Black families may not always eat the same, right? Because you may not always have the availability of every product on the face of the earth. So that's where you get how, the food of the African, upon coming to America, was basically plant-based. We were not necessarily introduced to a lot of proteins until being brought here. We did have proteins, of course, in Africa, but proteins were only really served for special occasions, right? So that is kind of the paper in a quick little brief introduction, brief description of the paper. But what I want people to kind of take away from this is that the food of the South definitely has been influenced by the African and by the African American, and it definitely starts back from discussing those formerly enslaved and freed cooks who are cooking food, specifically here in the city of Charleston, whether it was what we think of Southern food, whether it was French food, so on and so forth. That is the basis of the food, of the cuisine, and that is kind of the basis of the work that I do, is really wanting to expose people to those stories, and specifically exposing those people to those who don't have names. So referring back to those ads, right? They don't have names. So with my work, I hope to give a name, a face, a voice to those people, but still honoring the legacies of the Nat Fullers and the Tom Tullys. And then of course we move into, the other great Black chefs of the world, Joe Randall, Edna Lewis, Mama Dip, Princess Pamela, all these people who create Southern food. I can take questions if anyone wants to ask questions.
Great, thank you so much, Kevin. That's really enlightening, and we do have some questions, so I'll jump right in. The question I think I really want to start with is, did the African Americans that were brought to the United States bring their cooking skills with them? You said that they were
Yes.
cooking on the ships, and how does that then translate into how much they've influenced Southern food?
Well, they definitely brought a lot of their cooking techniques, the use of different spices, the use of cooking in leaves that we see in other types of cuisine. They brought all that stuff with them, and they were able to do that and use that on the plantation, right? And when we talk about some of the ingredients, Africans on the plantation were able to grow or have their own gardens, right? And they had gardens, but they would have what I like to call as secret gardens, where there were specific things that they grew for themselves. Then, of course, through plantation life, of course, these things are discovered, and then, of course, they introduce them to their slave owners. And we talk specifically, for me, we talk about greens, right? Understanding how to cook greens, how to take a bitter green and make it palatable, right? Collards, mustards, even dandelion greens are things that we have brought, to the Southern soul food canon.
Great, thank you. And I think that there's a really important narrative in there. And I want to say that we have an hour today, and you are literally writing a book about this. So I think we could spend weeks talking about this. There's so much to know in here. And I think one thing that I want to just sort of maybe send back to you is the idea that if these are the foods being cooked in the kitchens of the elite and the wealthy, and oftentimes those are the ones that create, what is that lexicon? How are we defining this food culture? But I think the thing that you've dug into in your research is that they weren't cooking that food, they were enjoying it. And then it gets lifted up into the lexicon, the food culture of the area. So with that in mind, Rosemary has asked, what is the most influential or significant contribution to American foodways of African American and Southern cuisine, which I think is a huge question. And I don't know.
It's a very huge question. And that's a very difficult question to answer, because there's been so many things that you can attribute to the African American as it relates to food in general. Like for me, you can't talk about food without talking about the African American throughout the world, because we were displaced in different parts of the world throughout history. So, it definitely is a huge question to answer. But if you, just think about certain dishes that we enjoy that come from that soul food, Southern food canon that were created. Macaroni and cheese was something that was, in essence, created by George Washington's slave cook, who initially it was called macaroni pie. And it wasn't made with elbow macaroni like we see it today. It was made with spaghetti noodles, actually. And it wasn't anything dealing with cheddar cheese. It was, it was Parmesan cheese, and it was butter, and it was baked in a pie, right? And then, of course, we graduate into what we know today as macaroni and cheese. But however, once again, there's so many different ways of making macaroni and cheese. I make my macaroni and cheese differently than my grandmother makes it, but it still is macaroni and cheese because it has macaroni in it, and there is some type of cheese in it. So, you know, you just, you know, and I just encourage people to really kind of research where some of these dishes come from, because they have very interesting stories, not just because they come from African Americans or whatever. They just have very interesting stories on how they even come to us, and even the ingredients. And in reference, you speak about the book. I mean, that is what the book is about. I mean, we're talking initially, specifically, we're talking about things related to Charleston, but we talk about these ingredients, and we also talk about specific dishes that we attribute to being specifically from Charleston. I mean, we write about sweet tea in the book, which is interesting. We write about, of course, the Bradford Watermelon. We write about okra. We write about bene. We write about, you know, Carolina Gold Rice. You know, we write about the Lady Baltimore cake, which has some history here in Charleston as being a part of a movie, and the story of how this cake used to be a wedding cake in Charleston. And there's an interesting story of how this couple is getting married, and this gentleman goes to purchase the cake, and he falls in love with the woman that sells him the cake. I mean, just really crazy, interesting stories. Or about Bradford Watermelon, how it was so popular that people were stealing the watermelon from the patches, and the Bradford family back then poisoned specific watermelon. And of course, I believe someone in the Bradford family dies from eating a poisoned watermelon because he doesn't remember which of the melons in the patches are poison and which are not. So, you know, so it's just very interesting to kind of research and learn about, you know, not only the food and how we eat it and why we eat it, but where it comes from, and some of those really funny anecdotal things about specific dishes.
Yeah, I completely agree. I did a master's in gastronomy, and that is I think it enhances our enjoyment of the food as well. I think to really understand where it comes from, and I appreciate that you mentioned that, you know, you can make the food you want to make, but that there is an important part of crediting sort of the proper sources of that food, and I see lots of things coming onto the scene and being popularized without that story, without that history. And I appreciate your encouragement to look further, you know, take it upon yourself to understand where things come from, and to understand the food you're either cooking or eating, because every single thing has a story. And I think that's an interesting question, because as you said, there isn't a single contribution that's so important. I think what we're doing here is recognizing that the huge and sweeping influence of the African American community on Southern food and food in the States in general, really. So I really appreciate that, looking a little closer at the ingredient or the dish or whatever it is to really understand where it comes from and why it might be important to people or a culture. And so in these ingredients you've gone through with us, I think there's much to be learned there. So we'll share more resources to learn more about that. I want to note, we're going to keep you with us as long as you'll stay, but I want to note for folks that need to go on the hour, we will send a follow-up email with a recording of this conversation to you, so you can check back in and share it with folks. And also many resources of some of the things that Chef has mentioned, books and other chefs and other producers, with ways you can get your hands on Carolina Gold Rice and bene oil and that sort of thing, and more resources for learning. I have also noted all of your email addresses for those of you who have asked for a copy of Chef's paper, and I will pass those on to you, Kevin. So just a moment before some folks have to take off. There is another question that was in the chat, so give me a moment while I find it. Let's maybe go back to the seeds and the way the seeds were collected and stored, and are we still using those same seeds today? Is there sort of a legacy in some of those seeds? You mentioned this narrative of putting seeds in their hair, bringing them on the ships and growing them in their gardens. And are we still using these same seeds today? I think that some of them are an interesting example of resurgence of a thing that went away, came back. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, I do. I believe, you know, we're still using a lot of these, and as you say, there has been a resurgence of other products, other seeds, other types of peas that were grown by African Americans that are kind of making a comeback, right? The sorghum berry is one example of that, right? And back in 2000, I believe 2016, 2015, David Shields and I, and along with some other people, we hosted a field pea tasting where I prepared about 30 varieties of peas, and we had this comparative tasting, and it was black-eyed peas and rice peas and crowder peas, so many different varieties. And then we also, of course, you can't eat peas without rice, so we cooked different types of, or different streams of rice. We cooked this actual Thomas Jefferson red rice, of course, the Forbidden Tide black rice, and of course Carolina Gold rice. So those seeds are coming back, and through people like Anson Mills and Geechee Boy and Brian Ward, who grew, and he works at the Clemson Extension here. He grew a lot of those heirloom peas for me to prepare at this field pea tasting. And it was great to have people there like Natalie Dupree and Jessica Harris was there, and of course, BJ Dennis was there helping, and several other really great chef friends of mine were there assisting. But to be able to, and what the really great thing about that pea tasting was, I was able to cook those peas in the house in which Nat Fuller lived, in the actual kitchen where he lived, and stood in this room where the stairwell was, where he would actually walk upstairs to his bedroom. So, and you just to reiterate what you were saying about stories. I mean, those stories are important, and I stress to my students and anyone that is cooking that it's great to know how to cook a pot of peas, but what's even better is understanding where they come from and what the story is behind them, and how you can create your own story with those ingredients. Like for me, as far as the black-eyed pea and being one of the first things my grandmother taught me to cook, that is something that will stay with me forever, right? So it's very important. But yes, a lot of these things are coming back, and I mentioned fonio, and that's something that is starting to gain some popularity as well. And it's this really great grain. Once again, it's very easy to cook, and it's healthy. I mean, what more can you ask for from something that we eat in a world where we're buying things from these big box producers which may not always be all that great for you to eat, right? And we talk about the time that we're in, and for me, this is now the time for us to really kind of go back to supporting those local producers of, I don't care whether it's zucchini or lemons or what, but local producers, and then also getting involved in getting products from Anson Mills and Geechee Boy. And these products can be shipped directly to your home, and you don't have to be a restaurant chef to get it. You can go to the website, and they will ship you a 5-pound bag of Sea Island red peas if that's what you want. Right? And that's the beauty of it, because now these companies like that have had to pivot and make these products more available to the user, because more people are at home cooking due to the fact that we've been on lockdown. That it's a great way to get these products and experiment with them and cook them in your home and really learn about them and understand where they come from.
Excellent, thank you. If you see me glancing away, I'm still collecting emails. There is so much interest in reading your paper, so I'm trying to stay on top of it to collect those. Thank you for that. That I think is really interesting and important. And let's move on to another question. Michael mentions that Carolina Gold rice is the best tasting rice he's ever had and feels like it has a terroir. And can you talk about why it has this particular taste and what terroir is, and maybe a light definition?
Well, I mean, terroir is basically it's the flavor that comes from the ground in which you grow something, right? So anything in my opinion can have a terroir. We talk about terroir when we talk about wine, right? The ground in which those grapes are grown take off or take with them that flavor that comes from the ground. And that's the beauty of what Carolina Gold rice is. It's the ground in which it's grown, and then there's another brand called Laurel Rice that is flavored with fresh laurel leaves, right? So it's imparting that flavor onto that rice. So I love the flavor of Carolina Gold rice because it does. And it's like, even if you think of like basmati, the flavor of basmati rice compared to the flavor of just regular white rice, you're getting those aromatic notes from the ground. And that's, and I agree. I mean, it's a great flavored rice. And it's a little different to cook than normal or regular white rice, but if you can read and understand the recipe, you can make a really great pot of Carolina Gold rice. I mean, and even Anson Mills has a very detailed process and recipe on how to make or how to cook Carolina Gold rice, right? And I think once you master cooking rice, you can cook any rice, right? And rice is one of those things that is kind of difficult to cook. And my students learn that all the time in class. They say, oh, yeah, chef, we're going to make risotto. Well, no, risotto is not that easy to make, right? You have to understand how the rice reacts with the fat and the liquid that you put in it and all those other things. So, it's just important for people to understand that, cooking is more than just throwing something in a pan. You got to understand, especially with rice, the starch intake, how much liquid it can take on, how much liquid can it not take on, things like that.
Excellent. I always feel like rice is so much more instinctual than I ever thought. That's really just kind of getting the hang of it. Yeah, I can do this. This is like pretty simple directions, but it never feels that way.
Yeah, I have to remember like with my students, because when I'm teaching them how to make rice pilaf, I'm like, yeah, bing, bang, boom, pretty easy. They're like, no, chef, it's not that easy. And I have to remember that it's really not, because you have to understand how to cook rice in order to cook rice.
Mm-hmm. And I think this gets to something that I really love in food and with chefs and even just folks that love to cook at home, is there's this embodied knowledge that goes with a lot of these dishes. If you made rice with your grandmother when you were a boy, it's going to be different for you now. It's embodied, it's sort of in it. It's instinctual for you versus somebody who has to learn. Although I think that learning is obviously always great. But in your comments about honoring your heritage and your ancestors and the work that you do as Black cooks and chefs, I think there's a lot to be said in that, is the embodied knowledge that you are carrying into your work that is really important and worth that sort of exposure, I think, and honoring it in that way. That it seems almost like the skill that you carry with you is a way of honoring your grandmother.
Yes.
Great. Let's go with a couple more questions before I let you go. Can you talk a little bit about what gula is and what makes it distinctive? I think that we're hearing this a little more now without totally understanding what that refers to. And then also, could you talk about the term low country and what that refers to?
Well, Gullah, the Gullah people, the people of Gullah ancestry, they're direct descendants of people from West Africa that, of course, were brought over from Africa to this particular area. And there is off the coast that kind of starts up through kind of North Carolina, going in through South Carolina, going all the way down into Florida, which is called the Gullah Corridor. And that is where people of that descent kind of settled after slavery. They bring with us this really, complex, beautiful food. For me, it's more about coastal cooking, because it could be heavily seafood based, right? Because we talk about shrimp and grits, we talk about catfish stew, we talk about all these great seafood dishes. And of course, we talk about okra stew and so on and so forth. So these people, they're direct descendants of people from West Africa who were brought here, who cooked this particular type of food, and they use things like okra seeds. They use dried shrimp pureed as a thickening agent, or even as a flavor agent as well. Right. So these people, once again, after slavery, they settle into specific pockets of this area. And in South Carolina, it's more around kind of like the Beaufort, Hilton Head Island area, where they still hold on to those traditions that they brought with them from Africa, whether it's how they grow rice, what they cook, the rice, the art of rice making rice baskets. Right? And those of you who come through Charleston and have traveled up 17 through Mount Pleasant, and you can see almost on every corner there's a stand of a woman making a rice basket. You know, those are the old Gullah traditions that they still hold dear, and they were still able to hold on to those traditions despite being dispersed, or despite, you know, the onset of slavery. Then, of course, as we move into, you know, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, so on and so forth. So that's who Gullah are, and they're very much. It's very much about rice culture. It's very much about eating rice, cooking rice. It's always about those one pot dishes. So we talk about purloo, right? Which is, you know, very similar to, you have purloo, pilau, pilaf, jambalaya, right? And what is the common ingredient in all those? Rice. Other things, you know, purloo, or jambalaya, there's vegetables, and there's shrimp or sausage or other types of protein. So, I mean, it's basically it's the foundation of where those other rice dishes come from, right? Low country, basically low country is the area in Charleston, South Carolina, where the food of the low country is similar to the food of the Gullah. There's some distinctions, you know, based on some of the cooking techniques, based on some of the ingredients. But, you know, it's always heavily based in rice. It's always heavily based in that one pot cooking, and then also, you know, cooking in embers. Like, you know, chefs think, oh, I got this really great thing, I'm gonna cook my potatoes and cook cabbage in embers. Well, slaves have done that for hundreds of years, because they were only given one pot. So they had to make a complete meal. So in that one pot may have been purloo, but then on the embers of that open flame would have been a whole cabbage that gets beautifully roasted in those embers, or sweet potatoes or corn, so on and so forth. Other questions? I'm here. I'm not. You don't.
Yes,
I'm not in a rush.
I'm so sorry. I lost my mouse for a second, so I couldn't unmute myself. Great. Thank you for that. That's really interesting. I think there's a lot to be learned there. I wonder if the book Black Rice touches on that, and it makes me think of how much you can learn if you bear down on one ingredient. I think whether it's a tomato or rice or a potato, you know, there is a whole history therein.
Yeah, and I learned that researching for the book. I mean, we write about we write about okra, we write about tomato, and then like the introduction of tomato pie and its influences on, you know, how it comes to be this iconic Southern dish, and how it originally started with green tomatoes as a dessert, and then it elevates into red tomatoes using mayonnaise and cheese and all these other things, right? We write about boiled peanuts, right? So all these things. So it is great to kind of focus in. And if you want to learn about rice, I mean, Black Rice, The Carolina Rice Kitchen is also a really good book by Karen Hess to read. In the Shadow of Slavery does talk about rice, but those other two books really, those whole books are all about rice. So those are two books that I would recommend if you want to kind of get a good feel on rice and, how it, of course, how it makes Charleston and other areas of the South what it is.
Yes, and it's a really interesting story, and I think it really sheds a lot of light on sort of the true history of food in Charleston, which seems to me to be well loved and not terribly well understood. So
Yes.
that's a really great resource. Let's ask one more question. And somebody has asked if you have cookbook recommendations, but I think that I might ask you that offline, and we'll send that in a follow-up email to everyone.
Yeah.
One question to end sort of on a tasty culinary note, which is, what are some of the flavorings that originated with or were favored in Southern cooking, like herbs and spices, aromatics, the flavorings in that regard?
Well, I mean, definitely we have to talk about any type of chilies, specifically from Africa. They love spicy food. We've always incorporated many types of herbs into our cooking, and the beauty of Charleston being a port city, that all those spices come to us from other ports, and then of course we integrate those in our cooking. So of course, definitely chilies, black pepper, nutmeg. We even talk about curry, right? Curry is prevalent in a dish called Country Captain, that basically is braised chicken in a red sauce that has curry in it and is served with rice. It has raisins in it and almonds, and so there's just so many different spices and herbs that are found prevalently throughout Southern food in the cooking. Whether, once again, it could be parsley, rosemary. It's always a big thing because it's a nice big herb to use, specifically in because proteins in Africa were all about they cook chicken, but it was all in most areas it's about lamb, and we know lamb is a very heavy protein eat, and you need something to kind of bring out the flavor. So it's and also pickling. Pickling has always been a part of Southern food, and African Americans, as a way of preserving, and storing in salt, where we get confit from in French, that comes, that can be a direct correlation to what cooking in salt in Africa has done, so on and so forth.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's see, we'll wrap this up, and I'm just going to hand it over to you for any last comments or anything. And I really appreciate this. You're encouraging us to learn more and know more, understand more. I think there's a lot of power in information and education. And I think that this is a really good way to honor and recognize and celebrate the many cooks from the past and from today who are shaping Southern food and have shaped Southern food and food in general. So I think I just want to echo your encouragement to learn about the things you eat and the dishes that you love and the people who are responsible for them. Because at the end of the day, food is grown by people, cooked by people, and eaten by people. So it's really always about people, and important to pay attention to who is controlling the narrative.
Exactly.
So, and I think that, we are really lucky and grateful to have you to sort of walk us through this big picture of this really big subject matter, and hope to have more conversations like this in the future.
Yeah, I mean, because it is, even thinking about the paper, I mean, there was so much more I could have put in the paper, but it was just, they're like, Kevin, you have 90 to 120 pages, so let's really try to really ring it in and figure out in the direction. And I wanted to focus in on Charleston because that's where I live, and that's where, for me, a lot of this starts. But I mean, once again, I do want to encourage people to research and really look at food as being more than just what we put in our stomachs, because there's a story behind every ingredient that we put into a pot, right? And I think, even as I talk to future chefs and my students, them understanding the culture and the history and where ingredients come from makes them a better chef, because they learn how to properly respect those ingredients, and they learn how to properly respect the dishes and where they come from. Right? And if you can't respect the ingredients, you can't be a great chef, because that's what we do. We use ingredients. And taking something from this raw state into this beautiful cooked meal is a very important thing that we do. Right? And we should never kind of discredit or discount what chefs do, because it is a lot of work. And of course, those of you who worked in restaurants know the hours, the time away from home, the time away from your families. And then, of course, through a pandemic, not being able to keep a job, right? Because we know several, specifically Charleston, some of my favorite restaurants all had to close. And then, of course, for me, getting the calls from students saying, "Chef, I lost my job," and not being able to help them because they work in restaurants, but there's no restaurants open for me to help them find a job. So you just remember the work that we do, and that it's very important work that we do. And it's not just about throwing things in a pot or in a pan, and also just going back to honoring the stories and the people that create the food that we know, the food that we love, that we enjoy every day. And also just, always just remember the diversity in America's kitchens, and the people that are in the back of those kitchens, the undocumented African Americans who may not be at the chef level, are back there, doing something that's very intimate, preparing a meal for you. And it's always important to remember those people, and where it all comes from, and then also to enjoy food. As a chef, I'm not a brain surgeon, right? I'm not saving anyone's life. I'm preparing a meal, but it's still very intimate and still very important for you to honor and respect that. And I'm very happy to send the paper, or if you can put my email up, and people can email me with any other further questions. I will definitely send out any book recommendations. I mean, I'll send you my whole bibliography from my thesis. That will get people started right there. It's like 4 pages of books in that. So, and those books range from not just talking about food. It's just how food is an intersection of gender, race, power, sex, so many different things. So there's so many books out there that they can read.
Excellent. Well, I will definitely ask after that list, and we'll include it. I think we'll make a blog post with a long list of resources to learn more and know more. Chef, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your time with us today, and for all of the work that you do in the culinary space and in Charleston and in slow food and beyond, and for this opportunity to celebrate you a little bit and your work and that of your peers. So we really appreciate you so much. Thank you so much for your time, and I really hope we can have more conversations like this in the near future.
Yes, me too. Thank you so much.